The sky was overcast as the billionaire, Richard Langford, stepped out of his sleek black car. The cemetery was quiet, disturbed only by the soft rustle of wind through the trees and the distant caw of a crow. He carried a single white rose, his wife Margaret's favorite. It had been 5 years since she passed, yet the pain still found new ways to creep into his heart. Richard, always in control in the boardroom, became a different man here, stripped of power, vulnerable, just a grieving husband. As he approached her headstone, his steps slowed. But something caught his eye. A young woman knelt in front of Margaret's grave, her shoulders shaking with sobs. She wore a faded green waitress uniform, the kind you'd see in small-town diners. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun, and she clutched a small photo in her trembling hands. Richard stopped, puzzled. No one else ever came here. His wife had no close family left, no children, or so he thought. He watched her for a moment, torn between approaching and walking away. Who was she? Why was she crying at his wife's grave? The girl looked up suddenly, eyes red and full of shock, as if realizing she wasn't alone. She stood quickly, brushing away tears, apologizing under her breath. "I didn't know anyone else would be here," she said softly, her voice hoarse from crying. "I'm sorry." Richard's brow furrowed. He wanted to ask her 100 questions, but all he could manage was, do you know Margaret?" The waitress hesitated, her lips trembling. Then she looked down at the photograph in her hand and whispered, "More than you think, sir." Richard's world shifted, something tightening in his chest. He stared at the photo she held, but before he could see it clearly, she tucked it away, turned, and walked briskly toward the cemetery gate, leaving behind only questions, and a stunned billionaire standing before the grave of a woman he thought he truly knew. The next morning, Richard sat alone in his study, the early sunlight filtering through the tall windows, casting golden rays across the polished mahogany desk. He hadn't slept much. The image of the young woman sobbing at Margaret's grave haunted him. Her words, "More than you think, sir," played over and over in his mind like a cryptic riddle. Richard had built empires, negotiated billion-dollar deals, and survived corporate warfare, but nothing had unsettled him the way that brief cemetery encounter had. He poured himself a cup of coffee, but it sat untouched. Instead, he stared at the surveillance photo he'd instructed his driver to discreetly capture as the woman walked away. Grainy, but clear enough. He enlarged the image on his tablet. The name tag on her uniform read Anna. Her face, though strained with emotion, struck him as vaguely familiar. Was it possible she had a connection to Margaret? Unable to shake the unease, Richard summoned his private investigator, Malcolm Reese, a former intelligence agent with a talent for uncovering the truth others wanted buried. Within a few hours, Malcolm had what Richard needed. "Her name's Anna Keller," Malcolm reported, dropping a thin file on Richard's desk. 24 years old. Waitress at Mel's Diner in Brookville, about an hour from here. No criminal record, lives alone, raised in foster care from age 2. No known connection to your wife, officially. Richard flipped through the file. Anna's eyes stared back at him from her ID photo, haunting, sad, and strangely familiar. A knot tightened in his chest. "Foster care," he repeated. "Yes. Biological mother died in a fire. No father listed on the birth certificate." Richard leaned back in his chair, thoughts racing. Margaret had been secretive in the final years of her life. She'd often driven out of town alone, brushing it off as charity work or solitude. Could Anna be the reason? Was there a past Margaret had hidden, even from him? "I need to meet her again," Richard said quietly, more to himself than Malcolm. Reese tilted his head. "You want me to bring her in?" "No," Richard said, standing slowly. "I'll go to her." And with that, the billionaire who rarely left his fortress-like estate was preparing to walk into a dusty diner, to chase the ghost of a secret that might rewrite everything he thought he knew about his wife, and maybe himself. The bell above the glass door jingled softly as Richard stepped into Mel's Diner, a small town spot frozen in time. The scent of bacon, fresh coffee, and old linoleum greeted him like a wall of memories from a life he'd never lived. The checkerboard floor, the squeaky red booths, the faded Elvis poster on the wall, it was the kind of place Margaret would have found charming. He wondered, not for the first time, if she had ever sat in one of these booths, sipping coffee, watching Anna from a distance. The few patrons in the diner barely looked up, save for an elderly couple in the corner who gave him a quick glance before returning to their breakfast. Richard, in a tailored charcoal coat and polished Italian shoes, clearly didn't belong here. He stood out, and he knew it. But he wasn't here for comfort. He spotted Anna almost immediately, working behind the counter. Her movements were quick but distracted. She smiled at a customer, but it was forced, a shadow of what it should be. There was a tiredness in her eyes, something that didn't come from a long shift, something deeper. Richard took a seat at the counter, 3 stools down. She didn't notice him at first. Only when she turned with a steaming coffee pot in hand did her eyes meet his, and her entire body stiffened. The smile vanished. Her grip on the pot tightened. "You," she said under her breath, not angrily, just in disbelief. "Me," Richard replied quietly. "Mind if I sit here?" Anna looked around, unsure, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Finally, she gave a hesitant nod. "Coffee." He nodded. "Please." She poured without meeting his gaze. "You followed me." "No," he said. "I looked for you." A long silence stretched between them as the murmur of the diner continued around them. He took a sip. "You were crying at my wife's grave. And you said you knew her more than I think." Anna placed the pot down, both hands resting on the counter like she needed them to steady herself. "I shouldn't have been there. I wasn't trying to stir anything up." "I don't think you were," he said gently. "I just want the truth." Anna swallowed hard. "Your wife, Margaret, she used to come here. Once a month, for years. She always sat in that corner booth. Never said much, but she watched me like she was memorizing every detail. She'd tip big. Sometimes she left me notes, little things. Encouragement." Richard's heart pounded. "Why?" "She told me once," Anna whispered, "that I reminded her of someone she loved, someone she lost. I never understood. Until I found the old letter in her last note. It wasn't addressed to me, but it mentioned a child. A baby she had to give up. I think I'm her daughter." The diner vanished around Richard. Everything else faded into silence. The past 5 years of mourning, of confusion, of unanswered questions, they all tilted, reshaped by the possibility that Margaret had carried this secret for decades. Anna stepped back, her hands trembling. "I didn't come to ruin anything. I needed to feel close to her. That's all." Richard stared at the young woman before him, her eyes so much like Margaret's. And for the first time in years, his heart began to feel something he thought it had buried with his wife, Hope. Richard sat in his car outside the diner for nearly half an hour after leaving, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if letting go would make everything unravel. The words Anna had spoken inside echoed in his ears like an unresolved chord. "I think I'm her daughter." It didn't feel real. Margaret had never told him. Not once in their decades of marriage. No hints, no signs, nothing to suggest she had ever given up a child. But the look in Anna's eyes, the way her voice trembled when she spoke, it hadn't felt like a performance. It had felt like truth. Later that day, back at his estate, Richard pulled out the old wooden chest from his closet. It was where Margaret kept her personal things, diaries, letters, mementos from her younger years. He hadn't had the heart to look through them after she passed. But now, driven by a mix of fear and longing, he unlocked it. Inside, he found yellowed pages, brittle photographs, and a leather-bound journal. He opened it slowly. Margaret's handwriting greeted him, elegant, precise, and familiar. He flipped through the pages, scanning for anything that might lead to Anna. Then, on a page dated April 16, 2000, he froze. "Saw her again today. She doesn't know me. Just a little girl playing near the foster home gates." She looked up, and for a moment, I saw myself. Richard's breath caught. "I want to talk to her. I want to tell her everything. But what would I say? I gave you away, and now I watch you from afar like a coward. She deserves better. So I leave money in the donation box. It's not enough. It's never enough." The entries continued sporadically for years, brief notes, always centered around the girl she had once given up. She never mentioned a name. But all the timelines, the locations, even a note about a diner with blue curtains and the best lemon pie, they all matched Anna's life. Richard sat back, overwhelmed. How could he have not known? Margaret had lived with this guilt in silence. She'd built a life with him, carried their love, yet there had always been this hidden part of her heart that beat only for the daughter she lost. By the time the sun began to dip beneath the trees outside, Richard had made his decision. He couldn't change the past. But he could honor Margaret's hidden pain. And he could give Anna what Margaret never could, a family. He picked up the phone and dialed Malcolm again. "I need a DNA test," he said quietly. "Discreet. I want to know the truth, no matter what it is." On the other end of the line, Malcolm didn't ask questions. "I'll make it happen." As the line disconnected, Richard felt a strange mixture of dread and anticipation rise within him. The past had opened a door, and now there was no turning back. 3 days later, Anna sat nervously in a private office on the top floor of one of Richard Langford's buildings, a towering structure of glass and steel that made her feel like she didn't belong the second she walked through the front doors. Everything smelled of expensive polish and power. The elevator ride alone had made her nauseous, and now she sat across from the very man who had haunted her thoughts since their last meeting, unsure of what was about to happen. Richard entered the room with the quiet composure of someone who had spent a lifetime commanding boardrooms, but today there was something different in his demeanor. The sharp edges were softened. His eyes looked tired, not from work, but from the weight of something much deeper. He took a seat across from her, folded his hands, and let the silence settle for a moment. Anna fidgeted with the strap of her purse, unable to meet his gaze. "I had the test done," Richard said quietly, his voice steady but subdued. Anna's heart dropped. She blinked, suddenly frozen. "You did." He nodded. "I didn't want to pressure you into anything, so I had it done through a discarded napkin you used at the diner. I hope that doesn't upset you." Anna shook her head slowly. I just didn't expect this to move so fast." Richard leaned forward slightly. "The results came back this morning." A pause. "You are Margaret's daughter." The words hit like a wave crashing through glass. Anna sat back, stunned, her breath catching in her throat. She had told herself not to hope. She had convinced herself it would be a mistake, a misunderstanding, a coincidence. But now, hearing it spoken aloud by this man, the husband of the woman who had watched her grow up from a distance, felt like stepping into a dream she hadn't dared to have. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. "All this time, I thought maybe, but now. I know it's overwhelming," Richard said gently. "It is for me too." Anna nodded, covering her face with her hands. "She knew about me. She watched me. Why didn't she ever tell me? Why didn't she come talk to me?" Richard's voice softened even further. "She was afraid. I think she never forgave herself for giving you up. I found journal entries. She wrote about you often. She never stopped thinking about you, Anna." The sound of her name on his lips made her look up. For the first time, their eyes met without fear. Without confusion. Just the shared ache of a connection they had never prepared for. "She wanted to protect you," he added. "Maybe she didn't know how to be a mother again. But I believe she loved you deeply. And I think, she hoped, somehow, you'd find her." A long silence hung between them, filled with the weight of years lost and the impossible reality now taking shape. "So what now?" Anna finally asked, her voice barely audible. Richard looked at her, and for a moment, he wasn't a billionaire or a grieving husband. He was simply a man trying to piece together the last missing fragment of the woman he loved. "Now," he said slowly, "we figure out what this makes us. Not with expectations. Not with pressure. Just, one step at a time." Anna exhaled shakily, a fragile smile breaking through her tears. And for the first time in both their lives, the past wasn't something to fear, it was something to understand. A week later, Richard invited Anna to the Langford estate, an ivy-wrapped mansion nestled on the outskirts of the city, far from the noise and eyes of the world he'd ruled for so long. It was the first time Anna had stepped into the kind of world she'd only seen in magazines or glimpsed through restaurant windows. Everything about the place felt foreign: the towering gates, the circular driveway lined with trimmed hedges, the old stone fountain quietly trickling in the center like it had been doing for a century. As the main door opened, Anna hesitated on the threshold. Part of her still felt like an intruder, like someone pretending to belong. She clutched her bag tightly, unsure of how to carry herself among marble floors and chandeliers. But then Richard appeared at the top of the staircase, not in a suit, but in a simple sweater and slacks, casual, disarmed, almost human in a way she hadn't seen before. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, offering a faint smile. "I almost didn't," Anna admitted. "But I thought, if she spent her last years here, I want to see what she saw. Walk where she walked." He nodded thoughtfully and gestured for her to come in. The two moved through the halls in quiet conversation, Richard pointing out small things. Margaret's reading nook by the window, her favorite painting, the sunroom she filled with flowers every spring. To Anna, it felt like exploring a museum of someone she'd only begun to understand. Every corner whispered stories that had been kept from her. Some made her smile. Others made her ache. Eventually, Richard led her into a small room on the second floor, Margaret's private study. The walls were lined with books, photographs, and artifacts collected from years of travel. In the center of the room was a cedar writing desk, and atop it, a sealed envelope with Anna's name written in delicate cursive. Anna froze. "Is that? She wrote it for you," Richard said quietly. "I found it the day after we got the test results. Hidden in a drawer I never opened. I think, part of her always hoped this moment would come." With trembling hands, Anna picked up the letter and sat down on the nearby loveseat. Richard stepped back, giving her space. As she unfolded the page, her mother's words flowed across the paper, every curve of ink heavy with love and sorrow. "My dearest Anna, if you are reading this, then something impossible has happened. I can only pray that you've found your way back to me, in some form. Not a day passed when I didn't think of you, your smile, your laugh, the life you might be living. Giving you up was the hardest thing I ever did. It was never because I didn't want you. It was because I couldn't give you what you needed then. But I never stopped loving you. I watched from afar, too afraid to disrupt your life, too broken to ask for a place in it. But I've loved you every second, Anna. If Richard is with you now, I hope you know he's a good man. I didn't tell him about you, not because I didn't trust him, but because I couldn't face the pain all over again. Maybe I was wrong to stay silent. Please, forgive me, and know that you were never forgotten. Never unloved. Never abandoned in my heart." Anna's tears fell freely, soaking the bottom of the letter. She pressed it to her chest, unable to speak. Richard sat beside her, silently placing a hand on her shoulder. In that quiet room filled with shadows of the past, something shifted. The space between grief and healing narrowed. And for the first time, Anna wasn't just a waitress or a stranger at a grave. She was a daughter, claimed not by words alone, but by the weight of truth, loss, and unconditional love. The next few weeks unfolded like a slow, delicate unraveling of the past. Anna found herself returning to the Langford estate more often, not because she felt obligated, but because, for the first time in her life, she felt tethered to something real, something that went beyond diner shifts and lonely walks home. Richard, too, was changing. The once rigid man who had defined his life with schedules, acquisitions, and numbers was beginning to soften in quiet, unexpected ways. He'd stopped going into the office every day. He started eating breakfast at the sunroom table where Margaret once sat. Sometimes he would simply sit in the garden in silence, while Anna read beside him, both of them sharing space in a way that didn't need constant words. One chilly morning, Anna stood in Margaret's greenhouse, gently watering a row of delicate white orchids. The air smelled of soil, citrus, and lavender. It was her favorite space now, a place where she felt closest to her mother, not the idea of her, but the woman she was learning to love through memories, letters, and quiet stories Richard had begun to share. Those were her favorites, Richard said as he stepped inside, nodding toward the orchids. Anna looked up, smiling softly. "I can see why. They're elegant, kind of quiet, but strong." She said the same once, he said with a chuckle. She always said flowers were better listeners than people. Anna set the watering can aside and brushed her hands on her jeans. "You know, the more I learn about her, the more I wish I had just one conversation with her. Just one honest conversation, face to face." Richard leaned against the doorframe, his expression heavy with the ache of shared regret. She would have wanted that too. I think she was waiting for the right moment. But sometimes we wait so long for the perfect timing, we lose the chance altogether. Anna nodded, her gaze distant. "Do you think she was ashamed of me?" "No," he said immediately, walking closer. "Never. If anything, she was ashamed of herself, for not being brave enough to be the mother she wanted to be. She loved you. Every bit of evidence I've uncovered points to that." A silence fell, thick with things unsaid. Then Anna turned toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think I belong here?" Richard took a deep breath. "I don't think it's about belonging in the way people usually mean it. I think you're part of Margaret's story. And she's part of yours. That makes this place part of your story now, too, if you want it to be. Her eyes welled with emotion again. I don't know what to do with all of this. I've spent my whole life not being wanted. And now suddenly, I'm someone's daughter. I'm her daughter. Richard stepped forward and placed his hand gently on her shoulder. You're more than that, Anna. You're her legacy. And whether you stay here or not, whether you want to explore what this means or walk away, you have every right to choose. But know this, Margaret would be proud of the woman you've become. A tear rolled down Anna's cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. She let it fall. And in that greenhouse, under the filtered light and surrounded by her mother's plants, she allowed herself to feel something new. Not just loss, but belonging. And slowly, without needing to say it, both she and Richard began to understand, they were no longer just connected by a grave. They were bound by something living, something still unfolding. Something Margaret had left behind in both of them, the courage to rebuild. A month later, the Langford estate looked different, not in its structure or design, but in its energy. What had once been a silent, echoing mansion now felt, lived in. A forgotten music room on the east wing filled daily with the soft sounds of Anna playing the old upright piano, fingers stumbling through Margaret's favorite classical pieces. The kitchen, once cold and run like a showroom, now bore signs of everyday life, coffee mugs left on the counter, handwritten notes on the fridge, a half-finished pie recipe spread open on the island. Richard watched it all quietly from the periphery. He didn't interfere, didn't try to shape Anna's presence into anything. He simply let her be, and for the first time in years, the house breathed again. One afternoon, Richard returned from a meeting, to find Anna in the living room, crouched in front of an open storage trunk. Dust floated in the slanting sunlight as she lifted out a bundle of Margaret's scarves, holding one to her face and inhaling its faint, familiar scent. I hope you don't mind, she said as he stepped into the room. I wanted to look through more of her things. He walked over and knelt beside her. Of course not. This house, it's as much yours now as it was hers. Anna gave him a long look, one filled with gratitude, uncertainty, and something deeper. You know, there's still this little voice in my head that keeps asking me when it's all going to disappear. Like I'll wake up back in my tiny apartment above the laundromat, and this'll all be a dream. Richard's expression softened. I know the feeling. I keep expecting to find her sitting in that armchair by the fireplace. Like none of this ever happened. He paused, then reached into the trunk and pulled out a faded photo album. She started this just after we married, he explained. She always meant to keep adding to it, but life gets in the way. Anna opened it carefully. Inside were candid snapshots of a younger Margaret, on a beach, in a library, dancing barefoot on the lawn. And then, in the middle of the book, there was a photo Richard had never seen. Margaret, standing in front of a foster home gate, staring at something, or someone, just out of frame. Anna traced the edge of the photo with her fingertip, her breath catching. That's me, she said, voice trembling. I remember that day. I thought she was just a nice lady who smiled a lot. She loved you from afar, Richard murmured. And hated herself for doing it that way. Anna closed the album gently. She made mistakes. But she gave me something in the end. She gave me you. The words caught him off guard. It was the first time either of them had truly acknowledged their new bond in such plain terms. And for a moment, Richard felt the walls inside him, walls built from grief, guilt, and years of solitude, finally begin to crumble. Later that evening, Richard lit a fire in the study, and the two of them sat by the hearth. Anna held a mug of tea, her knees pulled to her chest. They sat in silence for a long while, watching the flames dance, wrapped in a peace that neither of them had known before. Eventually, Anna turned to him. Do you think she's proud of us? Richard didn't answer immediately. He looked into the fire, his eyes glistening. I don't just think it, he said quietly. I know it. Outside, the wind stirred the trees. Somewhere in the night, a fox barked once, then fell silent. Inside the Langford estate, however, two people sat shoulder to shoulder, not as Billionaire and Waitress, not as strangers brought together by coincidence, but as something far stronger. As family, forged not by blood alone, but by truth, forgiveness, and the quiet courage to begin again.